this way or not. It was always a life and times. There are biographers who tend to focus, who come from the direction of journalism. Some cases they start out as novelists, and they really focus on the development of this character. And that's a perfectly legitimate way to write biography. I guess because I come at it as a historian, I'm always thinking of the individual life, as a way of revealing a certain period in time and a certain larger group than the individual himself or herself. For example, with the Theodore Roosevelt book, Roosevelt was born in 1858, so he was a small child during the Civil War. He lived to 1919, so he lived through the First World War. And he became, for me, a transitional character, someone who tied American history from the Civil War, which is really kind of the end of the first period of American history, although I'll have to revise your thinking on that subject a little bit tonight when I get to talk about the gold rush, from the Civil War to really the modern age. After you get past World War I in American history, we're definitely in the modern period. And Roosevelt is someone whose life exemplifies this trend, because Roosevelt himself, he experienced a transition in his own life. There was another thing that attracted me about Roosevelt. He was a person with quite varied interests. And when you're looking for a life that exemplifies the times, it helps a lot if you have somebody with multiple interests, because since you're trying to explain the period in which he lived, if you have these various hooks that connect the individual to the times, it works out better than if you have someone with a single interest or area of expertise. When I chose to write about Benjamin Franklin, again I saw him as an individual who stood for or revealed a certain important development in American history. In the case of Franklin, he was born in the first decade of the 18th century, and he lived until the last decade of the 18th century. In this case, the title of the book is The First American. And it seemed to me that the important story about Franklin, aside from the very interesting aspects of the life, was the emergence in Franklin, and in fact in his generation, of an American identity. Franklin was born into the British Empire, and for most of his adult life identified himself as a loyal, in fact, as an enthusiastic British subject. But during the last 20 years of his life, he realized he was an American. He had a different identity than the identity he was born. Anyway, this is a long way of saying that biography is a way of telling certain kinds of stories in history, explaining, revealing certain important developments in history. But the window onto history of any biography is almost necessarily long and thin. It's as long as the life of the individual, and it's relatively thin because it always focuses on the individual. You can broaden it out a little bit if you've got an individual like Roosevelt or like Franklin, who had lots of irons in the fire, lots of interests. So with Franklin, I had to write about 18th century science and 18th century philosophy and British politics in the court of King George III and so on. So you can broaden it a little bit, but you've always got this long, narrow window. And that was fun. I enjoyed writing the books. And I'll go back to biography at some point. But I also realized in writing these two biographies that there are certain things that happen in history that don't fit the window like this. There are certain things that do, the emergence of this kind of identity, but there are other things that happen in history in what you could describe as not a long, narrow frame, but a short and quite broad frame. These tend to be episodes in history rather than trends that emerge over time. They tend to be things that sort of spring on the world all of a sudden. They could be, well, one very good example is wars. Unless you're talking about something like the 100 Years' War. In American history, wars are relatively short in time. They have a very broad impact, and they encompass thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. So I realized that there were certain kinds of history that unfold that way, that require this broad but relatively short window. And one of them would be something like the Civil War or the First or Second World War. But another one that occurred to me was the California Gold Rush. Now, I should say perhaps, a little bit about my own background and how I got to thinking about the California gold rush. I grew up in Oregon, and as a child growing up in Oregon, my father used to take me on weekend trips to various historical sites in Oregon. And I traveled, I'm sure, the lower 200 miles of the Lewis and Clark expedition 10 or 20 times in the course of my upbringing. And so, as a kid growing up in the West, I was tuned into developments in the West in a way that people in the East tend not to be. My wife is from Maryland. She thinks in terms of the Civil War. She thinks in terms of that sort of thing, where you grow up and you trip over the battlefield markers of the Civil War. In the West, things look different. And of course, I was aware of the California gold rush. When I was in college here, I had occasion to travel around the gold country, and I was quite intrigued for two reasons. One is that I was very taken simply by the natural beauty of the area. And it seemed to me that this was one of the most beautiful places that I'd ever seen. And as a kid coming from Western Oregon, which is lovely, but kind of damp at times, 340 days out of the year, to come to California, where it was actually quite dry, was quite a treat. Well, actually, it was a shock. When I first got to Stanford, it was just about this time of year. In fact, I was over visiting my son, and the freshmen are all moving on to campus today. And I remember arriving, and this time in September in 1971, I had visited this area once before in my life, and it was the preceding March. And I wasn't aware that this kind of a Mediterranean climate around here, where it rains in the winter, and then it doesn't rain from about the 1st of May until when? Thanksgiving or something like that. So when I saw the campus, when I saw the whole area, it was green, it was lush. This is lovely. And then I came and I got off the plane in the end of September. Oh my God, it's all burned up. What have I gotten myself into? Anyway, so I went to the gold country, and I found it very attractive. But I was really intrigued to visit various places around the gold country where I could read in the history books, had at one time or other during the early 1850s, might have been a town of 10,000 people. And you go there now, and there's nothing. It's just, there might as well have never been anything there. Maybe a historical marker if you're lucky. Now, this really caught my interest because I think, like most Americans, there is, I don't know, this probably applies to people in other parts of the world as well, but there is a tendency to think that history unfolds kind of in one direction. And for one thing, cities and states fill up with population. And once they fill up, that population doesn't go away. But then to know that there were certain parts of California where there had been all these people and they all went away. I thought this was quite strange. Anyway, so I kind of stuck this in the back of my head and thought it was a great story. At the time, I had no idea I would become a historian or write history, but it was there. And then after I got out of college, I spent a year as a traveling salesman, and I had a territory that stretched from Oregon to Colorado. And the reason it was so large was I got stuck with all the really marginal accounts. And so I didn't have much luck selling. I was selling cutlery. I didn't sell much cutlery, but I had lots of occasion to travel all across the American West. And one of the striking things about Western history is that you can stand in places along Interstate, well, it used to be 80, maybe it's 84, I can't remember how they renumbered it. But anyway, the highway that goes to Salt Lake City to Wyoming and beyond. It's 80, it used to be 80N in Oregon, and now they've renamed it as 84. Anyway, there are certain parts of that road where if you stand on the side of the road, as long as your back is to the highway, and you're looking out, you see a vista that people coming out on the Oregon Trail or on the California Trail saw. And it really hasn't changed in any important essentials. Now, that is strikingly different from the sort of thing one encounters in most of the East, for example. When I was trying to reconstruct Benjamin Franklin's childhood in Boston, you can go to Boston, and there are plenty of old buildings in Boston, but there aren't, I actually don't think there are any that date to the very early part of the 18th century. And the thing that's very interesting about Boston is that the geography of the place is quite different from the geography that existed in Franklin's time. They filled in Back Bay, they've moved the waterfront out, and so places where ships would come and dock are now a quarter mile in on dry land. So it's almost impossible to reconstruct visually what things looked like back then. But for Western history, it's quite possible to do that. Okay. then I went off and did some other stuff, and I eventually came back and wrote different kinds of history books. And so when I was thinking about doing a different kind of history than biography, I started thinking about what kind of episode that might relate to Western history could I do. And so I thought, well, maybe the California Gold Rush. And so the first thing that I did, and this is something that I encourage my students to do when they're doing the very initial research on any project, is find out what the conventional wisdom on the subject is. And an easy way to do that is to pick up a college history textbook. There's no wisdom more conventional than you will find in textbooks. And so I read various history textbooks on the California Gold Rush just to see what they said. And the average coverage was maybe a paragraph. And that was about it. Now, these are American history textbooks. Of course, if you look at the history of the West or the history of California, it looms much larger. But the point here was that in the thinking of most American historians, the California Gold Rush is this curiosity piece, this event that happened mostly to California. And that by itself renders it somewhat marginal. But it had an impact on these people who went to California thinking they were going to get rich and find gold. And then, well, it wasn't really all that important, because what we need to do, we as historians, need to get back to the main story, the main thread of the narrative, which is we're leading toward the Civil War and we got to go fight the Civil War. Because from the first half of an American history survey up through the Civil War, the main story is how everything led to the Civil War. And this, by the way, is something that historians, it's not just historians, but historians, I think, and I speak here as a historian, tend to fall into the trap of thinking that what did happen essentially had to happen, because we spend all of our time explaining why the things that did happen happened. And we often lose sight of the fact that they didn't have to happen. And they certainly didn't have to happen the way they happened. So, now I'm going to get provocative here and ask you to entertain for a moment the possibility that the Civil War did not have to happen. Okay, just put that in the back of your mind. I'm going to come back to it. Because when I was examining these history textbooks and I saw that the California Gold Rush was given such cursory treatment, I thought, this doesn't seem right. Because what I knew about the California Gold Rush was that there were a whole lot of people. There were 300,000 people who came to California in the space of just 3 or 4 years. Well, this might well have been the largest mass movement of peoples since the Crusades of the 12th century. And these people came from all over the world. Now, there must have been a bigger impact than one would imagine from one paragraph in an American history book. So I thought this deserves further examination. And as I began looking at the sources that are available for something like the California Gold Rush, I realized that this is any author's, any historian's delight, because there was something about the California Gold Rush that encouraged people to write about it. Now, I'm going to give you a recipe for, and I say this advisedly, a recipe for becoming literally immortal. You want to know how to become immortal? How many of you keep diaries? Good for you. Journals? Okay, on a regular basis. For those of you who already do it, keep doing it. Write journals for a long time. And then just make sure that when you die, they are handed over to your local historical society or library or something, so they will be made available to posterity. Now, the reason I say this is that, in the first place, if you do keep a diary or a journal these days, you're in a very exclusive group. Not many people do. But furthermore, historians, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, 300 years from now, will rely on you to discover what life was like, what ordinary life was like at the beginning of the 21st century in Northern California. And I say this as a historian who has examined, who's tried to reconstruct life in mid-19th century New York, for example, for the Theodore Roosevelt book, or for 17th and 18th century London, for the Benjamin Franklin book. You want to know how we know about life in London in the 17th century? We rely on the diary of Samuel Pepys. Okay? Pepys wasn't important. He wasn't all that interesting, but he was there and he wrote it down. And if you're here, write it down and make sure people find it. And you will become, of course, you won't be actually immortal, but you will be literally immortal in that you will show up in history books for the next 500 years. When I tell my students this, they're rather intrigued. Not enough to write diaries, but however. And most people in the 19th century did not write diaries, did not write journals, except when they were doing something quite unusual, like going on a journey far from home. Now, they did this for two reasons. In the first place, they knew that this didn't really commit them to keep a diary for the rest of their lives, because this adventure to California was going to be limited in time. By the way, I should point out, the same thing applied during the Civil War, which is one of the reasons there are so many first-hand sources on the Civil War. People went off to war, and they knew the war was going to last forever, and this was the biggest thing that had ever happened to them. And in many cases, of course, they left loved ones at home, and they wanted to tell the story to their loved ones. In the case of the gold rush, many of the people who left home had rather guilty consciences in doing so. They would often leave a wife and a couple of young kids at home and say, honey, I'm going to be gone for a couple of years. You keep things under control. And this wasn't universally greeted with enthusiasm. And so, of course, they would have to explain why this is for us, and so we can buy a house and we can actually make our future. Because the prospect was that they could earn more in one season in the gold mines than they could an entire career at their ordinary jobs. So anyway, they would write home, or they would keep journals that they would share once they got back. Now, people, did it ever occur to you that the word journal and journey come from the same root? People kept journals on their journeys. Now, we don't do it so much these days because, you know what we do instead? We take pictures. And then we inflict the pictures on our friends and relatives when we get home. But in those days, no one had a camera. And so if they wanted to describe what they saw, we take a picture of Niagara Falls or Yosemite or whatever. In those days, you'd have to write about it. And they wrote and said, boy, you wouldn't believe what I saw. And so they write it down. Anyway, so for any historian of the gold rush, there are hundreds, there are thousands of these letters, diaries, journals, and the like. And many of them, in many cases, they've been published. And one could say that probably in the best cases, most of them have been published. But the unpublished ones are around in libraries, the Bancroft Library, the Beinecke Library, the Huntington, the California State Library, California Historical Association. They're all over the place. And they're just more than anyone could ever use. But they are there. And for someone like me, one of the things that I try to do as quickly as possible when I'm getting into the story is to get a hold of the people who were there and try to find the voices of people who could tell their story. The best voices are the ones who are writing pretty much as they go. So somebody could say, we are stuck in the middle of the Carson Desert. We think we might die of thirst before we get to the other side. Now there's an immediacy to that transcends anything you'll get if somebody says, yeah, last week we were stuck in the middle of the Carson Desert and we weren't sure if we were going to survive, because obviously the fact they're writing after the fact means you give away the end of the story. They did survive. But still, and when you can find these voices, then the story comes to life in a way that it wouldn't otherwise. Anyhow, I decided to write about the California Gold Rush. I found all these sources. And as I was writing the story, it occurred to me that the folks who were writing these history textbooks really did have it wrong. That the California Gold Rush was far more important than most American historians, and probably most historians of much of the rest of the world, appreciated. And it seems to me that you can sort of break down the importance of the California Gold Rush into 3 or 4 categories. I asked you earlier to entertain the possibility that the Civil War might not have happened, might not have been necessary. Now, what do I mean by necessary? Was World War II necessary? Was the Vietnam War necessary? Well, I think there is a feeling among many people regarding American history that in some respects the Civil War was necessary to end slavery. that slavery was so entrenched in the South and it had become such a hot moral question that it required something almost as big, tragic, grand, destructive, horrible as the Civil War to expiate this original sin of American political life. And that certainly was a feeling that emerged during the war and after the war, because it would have been rather horrible to think that these 600,000 lives had been lost unnecessarily. But consider this. Slavery was an institution common to most European countries. In fact, it was common all over the world in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it was only in the United States that the ending of slavery required this horrendously large war. So, might there have been another way? Well, I really don't necessarily expect to convince you, but I want you to keep that possibility in mind, because there is a connection to the Civil War, and the connection is this. The thing that brought the slavery issue to a head, and the thing that had always made slavery so troublesome, was not the existence of slavery in the states. It was the question of slavery in the territories. What are we going to do about slavery, for example, in the Northwest Territory, the Ohio Valley? Well, the answer that the Continental Congress, the Articles of Confederation Congress, came up with is no slavery there. What are we going to do about slavery in the Louisiana Purchase? And the answer to that one was the Missouri Compromise of 1820, where slavery in the South and no slavery in the North. But the thing that made those solutions to this question about slavery in the territory possible, especially as regarded the Louisiana Territory, was that these new territories filled up very slowly. The Louisiana Territory was purchased in 1803. There were still, the vast majority of it was still unsettled as of 1850. And the Missouri Compromise took about 10 or 12 years to hammer out. But there was no particular hurry, and adjustments could be made. All right, we're going to let one new state in Missouri, so we'll balance it out by bringing in Maine as a free state. And as long as we've got time to solve these problems, then we can work things out. What the California Gold Rush did was to eliminate the element of time, or greatly to collapse the calendar. At the time of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican War, that formalized American control over Texas, and that brought California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, etc., into the United States, there were very few people living in those territories. A fair number in Texas, but that was already a done deal. But in California, New Mexico, Utah, there are very few people living there, and there was no reason to think that there would be very many people there in the next 25, 30, 40 years. California was valued not for its land, certainly not for its gold, because nobody knew there was gold in California, but for San Francisco Bay and for San Diego Bay, because these would be harbors on the Pacific that might be valuable over the next century. And everybody expected that there would be plenty of time. And then, right at the time that the treaty was being concluded, the negotiators were down on the Mexican border at the village of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Gold was discovered on the American River in California. And within the space of 24 months, there were 80,000 people in California. There were more people in California than in several of the states. And all of a sudden, this issue of what do we do about slavery in the Mexican Cession was brought squarely to the forefront of American politics. This was something that people hadn't expected to have to deal with for another decade at least. And when there were enough people in California by the autumn of 1849 that the Californians got together, held a constitutional convention, wrote a constitution. Now, they didn't have any authority from Congress to do this, but they wrote the Constitution, and they sent it to Washington and said, let us in. We've done all the stuff we're supposed to do, now just let us in the Union. And Congress initially balked, but it couldn't come up with a good reason to say no. After all, this is supposed to be a country based on self-government. The Californians had set up a government, and they had done all that they were supposed to do. So Congress, well, the South, did its best to keep California from getting into the Union. Well, California came in with an anti-slavery constitution. So California would be added to the ranks of the free states. And the South didn't want to go along with this, and people like John Calhoun objected to the California Constitution. They said it was extra legal. Who gave the Californians the right to do this? Send them back, rewrite it. We'll have to spend a lot of time thinking about this. But he couldn't get the votes. However, what he could get, what the South could get in exchange for admission of California as a free state, were sweeteners to the deal. The whole deal was called the Compromise of 1850. And the most important element, the most important quid pro quo for the South was the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act made it much easier for slave hunters from the South to go north and recapture escaped slaves. But it didn't stop there, because they could recapture people who had never been slaves in the first place. The burden of proof was on the accused, the person who is said to have been a slave, to prove that he hadn't been. Now, this outraged sentiment in the North, because northern sheriffs, northern judges, northern citizens were being compelled, against their will, against their sense of morality, to participate in the enslaving of African Americans. And it really brought home to people what this slavery question was all about. There were plenty of people in the North who they would have very easily lived with slavery as long as they didn't have to stare it in the face, as long as it just remained a peculiar institution of this strange region of the country. I should add one other thing. One of the remarkable things about the California Gold Rush, and this is a little bit odd if you think about it, to get from the North to the West, you had to go through the South. Now, that doesn't sound exactly right, except that, remember, Missouri was a slave state, and all the trails out west went through Missouri, with the result that hundreds of thousands of Americans from the North who never would have gone to the South, who never would have seen a slave auction, for example, and never would have been put face to face with what slavery really meant on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, they heard about it, but that's somewhere else. It's somebody else's problem. No, in fact, they would go to the slave auctions in St. Louis, and they would be appalled at what they saw. And so it tended to polarize this question of slavery, and it really pushed the issue of slavery right to the front of national consciousness. Within a few years, Congress decided to open up the Kansas and Nebraska territories to settlement. But you know precisely why they did it at that time? The main reason was that Stephen Douglas and other politicians wanted to build a railroad. Where? To California. And they wanted to build a railroad to California to make sure that California stayed in the Union. In fact, this question came to a head in 1860 and 1861, when the South seceded, and California, there was a strong pro-secession sentiment in California, because there were a lot of Southerners there, and in fact, it was a very strange situation. Slavery was actually practiced in California, despite the fact that the Constitution said it was illegal. So it was an odd thing. But anyway, California was threatening to leave the Union. It might not necessarily have joined the Confederate States of America, but it would have become an independent Pacific Republic. This was a grave danger to the Union in 1861, because what it meant was all that gold in California would not be going to the Treasury in Washington or the financial institutions in New York, but could easily head for the South. And so, in order to keep California in the Union, Congress very quickly passed the Railroad Act of 1862, which promised California a transcontinental railroad, if, of course, California stays in the Union. And immediately, all the secession sentiment in California dried up. Anyway, so one of the conclusions, one of the arguments I make in the book, is that the California Gold Rush had this decided impact on American political development by forcing the slavery question to a head before Congress and the country could figure out how to deal with it. Every time there had been a crisis in the past The first crisis was in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention, and then another crisis in 1820 with Missouri, in 1833 with the Tariff of Abominations, the nullification and all that. Another crisis in 1850. Every time Congress had had time to deal with this, and every time it had been able to deal with it peacefully. What California did was to eliminate that, more precisely, what the gold rush did with all these people in California was to eliminate that time and say you've got to solve it right now. And on that point and under those circumstances, the political wisdom of the country failed and the Civil War ensued. There was another very important consequence of the California gold rush, and that is that it reshaped, directly and indirectly, it reshaped the American economy. The first consequence of the gold rush was to send a lot of gold from California into the financial markets of the East. It also taught people, it led to other gold discoveries. Before the discovery of gold in California, people didn't go out looking for gold. Now, this is actually very interesting because it contributed to the notions of manifest destiny that were quite common in the 1840s. The idea that God was smiling on America, that God had a special destiny for the United States. And the evidence appeared overwhelming at the time. And Exhibit A was the fact that first Spain and then Mexico had controlled California for roughly 250 years before 1848. And in all that time, the Spanish and the Mexicans had never discovered gold. The Americans had controlled California for 2 weeks, and they discovered gold. Well, what more needs to be said? Well, after California, people began recognizing the kind of geology that seemed to include gold. A very good example of this was an Argonaut who came from Australia to California in 1850. His name was William, in 1849, excuse me. His name was William Hargraves. He'd been living in Australia for a while, and off he came to California, along with about 10,000 other Australians, who were not generally greeted with open arms in California, largely because Australia was known as the outdoor prison of the British Empire. And all of these felons were fleeing Australia for California, where the pickings presumably were better. William Hargraves found almost no gold in California. In fact, he nearly starved his first winter in the diggings. And he made very little money during his first digging season, his first panning season. He saved up his money, though, and he took note of something that was quite striking to him. He looked at the kind of geology where gold was found in California, and he said, you know, I've seen rocks like that back in Australia. And there's this certain place, it's in the Blue Mountains behind Sydney. And he conceived this idea that he was going to go back to Australia. He wasn't having any luck in California. And he was going to discover gold in Australia. And he did. And he went back, and in 1852, he discovered gold in Australia. And there had been this huge rush from the western part of the Pacific east to California in 1849 and 1850. When gold was discovered in Australia, there was a rush back the other way. And now it was the upstanding citizens of Australia who weren't so happy to see their Australian friends coming back. And so there was the gold rush in California, triggered a gold rush in Australia, triggered gold rushes to Nevada, to Colorado, to Idaho, to the Yukon, to Nome, to Siberia, triggered a half century of gold rushes. So the California gold rush taught the world what gold looked like, what gold formations looked like, and led to, that by one estimate, in the quarter century after the discovery of gold at Coloma in 1848, as much gold came out of the ground as had been dug out in the previous 3 or 4 centuries. So this made it possible, by the way, for the British gold standard, which was the standard of international commerce at the time, to become essentially worldwide. If not for all this gold, it would have been impossible. More importantly for the United States, the sudden peopling of California sparked the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Again, as I explained why this was the enticement to keep California in the Union. But the consequence of the Transcontinental Railroad and the first one, which was completed in 1869, and the others that followed, was to knit the United States into a single economic market. Now, what was the secret of America's ultimate economic predominance? Was it that American inventors were smarter than inventors in England or Germany or Italy or elsewhere? Well, the answer is no. There's certainly no evidence that that was the case. Was it the case that the United States' physical, natural resources were greater than those of all other countries? And the answer is, well, no. In fact, they were dwarfed by those of Russia. So what was the secret of the United States in terms of its economic development? The principal secret, and it wasn't not really any secret, was this single large national market, so that when the Industrial Revolution took off and manufacturers in Britain could build a steel mill to service the entire British market, well, the entire British market was not very big. And they couldn't ship steel to France or Germany because there were tariffs that prevented those imports. In the case of the United States, the Constitution, the federal Constitution, prohibited, and still does, interstate tariffs. Those have been a problem under the Articles of Confederation. So the federal Constitution of 1787 set the legal framework for this national market. The transcontinental rail system that was created starting in 1869 established the physical framework so that when Andrew Carnegie, for example, was building a steel mill in Pittsburgh, he could think in terms of this national market. And by the way, this was a model that has been and is still being copied in Europe today with the creation of first the European Common Market, then the European Union. So the California Gold Rush sparked the construction of the Transcontinental Road, which in turn led to the creation of this very large, single, unified market. So we got the political consequence, the economic consequence. A third consequence, I think, is perhaps even more striking, although it might be a little bit harder to document in any kind of straightforward way. And the subtitle of my book is The California Gold Rush and the New American Dream. It seems to me that the experience of California Gold Rush established an alternative to the received model of success, of material success in this country. The old framework was one that was inherited from the Puritans, as modified perhaps by Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard. The notion that material success was the result of decades of hard work, of steady, sober, thrifty industry. You keep your shoulder to the wheel and your nose to the grindstone, and you will succeed. Not in any grand sense, but you will develop a farm, for example, that you can hand down to your children. You will develop a business that will grow and thrive and you can be proud of and will support you and your wife in your old age. So success was something that came slowly, that came over time, and here's the key, that was closely connected to one's moral character. That you had to have these virtues of thrift, industry, sobriety, all the things, for example, that Poor Richard and Benjamin Franklin exemplified. And if you succeed, it's an indication that you have these. And this is closely wrapped up in the Puritan ethic. Moreover, if you fail, that's an indication of a failure of character. It's not just bad luck. It's not a failure of a business. It's failure of you as a person. Now, if this is what you believe, then you can imagine that you're going to think 2 or 3 times about taking risks, about doing the sorts of things that might lead to failure. This model, I would argue, was one that was essentially exploded during the California Gold Rush, because 2 miners could go out in the diggings, and they could be digging in what appeared to be identical locations, and the second could be working just as hard as the first and have suffered the same privations as the first, and the first strikes it rich and the second comes up empty-handed. What explains the difference? Sheer luck. It's not a failure of character. It's not even bad judgment. It's just bad luck. So what do we do with this? Well, in the first place, we forget this idea that failure is an indication of something wrong with you. And what do we learn from this? We learn that the thing to do is to go try again. Okay, if you can't find gold in this place, go over there and dig for gold there. And if you don't find gold there, go dig somewhere else. And keep digging, and eventually you'll find it. Okay? You might not find as much as you want to, you might not find as much as your neighbor, but the point is to take risks, to put yourself on the line, to try and try again. Don't fear failure, but to go out and give it your best shot. Now, I talked longer than I expected to, but I'm going to close with another sort of thought experiment. Why do you suppose, and this I can say is speaking sort of at ground zero of Silicon Valley, why is it that Silicon Valley developed here and not somewhere else in the country? If you had been a betting man, and I was in college in the early 1970s, at just about the time that the first person coined the term Silicon Valley, and almost none of what you see around here, I mean, I can tell some of you are older than I am, and if you've lived in the area, you've seen what has happened. It wasn't here. It wasn't anything like this. In fact, there were orchards and all that other stuff that you hear about. If you had to bet in, say, 1965 on what was going to be the cradle, the incubator of the information industry, smart money probably would have been on the Boston area, on Route 128, because it had all the stuff that was necessary, all the stuff and more that this area had. It had not only Harvard, but MIT, and all those hundreds of other colleges in the Boston area. And it had the pre-existing electronics firms, and it had the expertise. So why did Silicon Valley develop here and not around Boston? Now, this is where I'm going to go out a little bit on a limb, see how far I can take you with me. I would argue that there was too much of that old model of success. After all, that was the heart of the Puritan ethic. And people in Boston, the Boston area, were not tuned in to risk-taking the way people out here were. This was the land of the gold rush. This was where people went precisely to take risks. So, the long-term consequence of the California gold rush is all the stuff you see around here. And it happened here not by coincidence. I'll stop there and be happy to take any questions. I hope I provoked you a little bit. Thank you. Yes, in the back, please.
That's terrific. Well, actually, I guess I've come up with a couple questions.
Okay.
One is, now that Stanford and Silicon Valley are what they are they as self-satisfied as Boston has always been? So where will the next big
It's
move
very
come?
hard to be as self-satisfied as Boston is. Now, I should say that I was writing this book while the internet.com high-tech bubble was still going up. And between the time I was writing and conceived the whole idea, of course, it burst and went down. But that's no problem, because this was quite characteristic of the way life was in the goldfields. One of the characters that I focus on in the book is Mark Twain, who was an early speculator in Nevada mining stocks. And, in fact, I quote some passages from Twain's own work where he talks about how he was getting filthy rich for doing basically nothing. These stocks that he kept, people were giving him stock, and they kept going up and up and up, and he was rich, and then boom, it all collapsed. So it's happened before. It'll happen again. I'll take another, well, let me ask somebody else to ask a question. Yes, please.
This is probably has a simple answer, and I just don't understand it. But I can't see the relationship between the individual miners finding gold and enriching the U.S. Treasury, the federal Treasury.
The gold, the question was, how did the gold in California go to the U.S. Treasury? Well, it went, actually, first it went to, there was a mint that was established in San Francisco, and so it went through the mint. But it went to the financial institutions of the North. In some cases, actually, it went in bullion, and it went across Panama.
How did it get directly? I mean, it just seems like it would be a zero-sum game, that the person would find the gold and buy something with it.
Right. Oh, yes. I'm sorry.
Right.
It would flow through the channels of commerce in California into San Francisco. And then when merchants in San Francisco were buying their inventories from the east, they would ship the gold east. And so it would typically go to New York, But as long as it stayed in the north, the merchants in San Francisco were buying from northern merchants rather than, if California become independent, then it could go south. Now, as a matter of fact, I mean, they could do business with Southerners. Once the South seceded, the North made every effort to make sure that people in California and everywhere else in the North did not do business with the South, which led to one of the episodes that I describe in the book, where a Southern sympathizer named Asbury Harpending arranged to try to seize some of the gold ships that were heading out of San Francisco, to capture the gold ships and then hijack the ships and send them to the South, which was sorely in need of the hard currency, the gold. Okay. Yes, in the back, please.
Oftentimes you hear that the people that made the money in the California gold rush were not the people with the pickaxes getting the gold out of the ground, but actually the people selling the pickaxes. I've always been curious whether that's more legend than fact. Not sure if you encountered any information on that front.
The question is, did the miners themselves make the money, or did the people who were mining the miners make the money? And the answer is there was money made in both areas. The most reliable fortunes, the ones that lasted the longest, tended to be the latter. The people who sold provisions and the like to the miners. Leland Stanford is a good example. But there's one of the examples that I like to cite is Samuel Brannan. Samuel Brannan had a dry goods store at Sutter's Fort in January of 1848 when the news drifted down from the American River that James Marshall had discovered gold. Now, as a child, I naively thought that if I had discovered gold, I certainly would do my best to keep it a secret. And just last week, I was addressing an elementary school group, actually my son's elementary school in Texas. And I asked them, I said, okay, if you had found gold, what would you do? And they all said, oh, we'd keep it a secret. We wouldn't tell anybody. And I said, that's exactly what I'd do. But their business model was not the same as the business model of Sam Brannan, because Brannan recognized that he was going to make money not by getting the gold out of the ground, but by getting customers. And so he gathered some gold. He managed to get a hold of some gold that was coming down the river, and he went to San Francisco, and he went running around the town, the village of San Francisco, waving this jar of gold, saying, gold, gold on the American River. Now, this raises an interesting point, because rumors of gold, now one might think, gold was discovered in January of 1848. So why is that football team up there called the 49ers? Why not the 48ers? The reason is that rumors of gold, reports of gold, made it back east by the end of the summer of 1848. However, there were a lot of people who thought, sort of like maybe they knew folks like Sam Brannan, and they figured, from Brannan's standpoint, it's immaterial whether there's really gold there or not. If he can create a rush to California, he's going to make money. So a lot of people discounted the rumors. A lot of people thought this is just disinformation being spread around. So it really took confirmation when a big, sometimes called a tea caddy or an oyster can of gold was delivered from California back to Washington at the end of November of 1848, and it was chock full of gold. And then President Polk announced and basically officially confirmed the rumors that there was gold in California. And by then, people had to wait till the next spring to head off toward the west, and that's why they're all called 49ers. Other questions? Yes?
Just one thought, because I love the whole theory you presented. But the name California, comes from the Spanish writer Montalvo.
Okay.
And he wrote about that there was gold in California in the 1600s.
On the basis of no evidence whatsoever.
Right, no evidence. But
yeah.
And don't forget Cortez and the gold in Mexico.
Right.
So maybe that's what they were thinking of.
Well, there was it became a regular practice in Western history when, after the discovery of gold in Mexico, that is by Cortez, and in Peru by Pizarro, and there was a notion that there was gold out there. Now, I should point out that the Spanish were above actually prospecting for gold. What they would simply do is go out and occupy a village and capture the leaders and say, tell us where the gold is. And what they usually did, the locals caught on to the idea that they would tell the Spanish, oh yeah, there's gold. It's a couple hundred miles that way. And so the Spanish, like Coronado, for example, headed all over the center part of the North American continent looking for gold, which wasn't there. And of course, anybody who's writing about California and is trying to, well, even in those days, they were trying to sell books. So what they would do is describe this wonderful place, and there's nothing that caught the attention of audiences for things like that, like stories of gold. Other questions? Yes?
I was wondering if you could briefly talk about the surge in nativism and xenophobia in California, sort of that happened when it became that territory, that state, when the surge of Americans came across or around. If you could talk about that a bit.
The question is, what about the emergence of nativism, of this fear, dislike of foreigners in Gold Rush, California? And it emerged, well, interestingly, and one of the things that I hadn't really been aware of before I started doing the research was that California in 1852 was by far the most cosmopolitan part of the United States. The news got from San Francisco, got from California, across the Pacific far sooner than it got to the eastern part of the United States. And there's a simple reason for this if you look at a map of the world and you understand how people traveled in 1848. If you wanted to get from San Francisco to New York, you had to go a distance that was roughly 2/3 of the way around the world. You had to travel clear around South America, so it was roughly 16,000 nautical miles. And so you could hardly be farther from San Francisco in a real sense of how to get there than being in New York at that time. So the word got out to the west coast of Mexico right away. And thousands of people came from Mexico to California. The word got down the western coast of South America, and thousands came from Chile and Peru. The word got out across, the word went north to Oregon. As an Oregonian, it always galled me that all these nice, upstanding people in Oregon abandoned the lovely Willamette Valley for California when they heard of gold. But that's what happened. Oregon was depopulated. The Sandwich Islands were... They're large. They had a very interesting and diverse population through much of this period, and they were drained of population. The news got out to Australia. The news got to China. By 1852, there were about 25,000 Chinese in California. So California looked like no other part of the United States. It was far more diverse in terms of the ethnic origins, in terms of the racial origins of the people who were there. Oh, and I should point out that the 49ers came from all parts of the eastern United States, including the South, and many people brought their slaves. Free blacks came. So it was a society unlike that which people saw anywhere else in the United States. So that was something that the 49ers, the ones from the eastern United States going out to California, really hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. There was a second reason for the rise of natives. I should say a second, maybe good reason, in the sense that it made sense to the people who thought about it. They asked themselves, why was it that California was part of the United States? Well, it was a result of the Mexican War. The United States won the Mexican War. More precisely, American soldiers, American boys, fought bravely against Mexico and won this war. Now, according to the thinking of the time, the war had been provoked by Mexico over Texas and all of that. We can leave aside whether that was a justified opinion, but that was the thinking of the time. So, how was it that California and its gold became American? Through the blood and effort of Americans. And these Americans got out to California. What did they see? All these foreigners, for heaven's sake, who were taking the gold. So, to the extent that that's a good reason, that was one of the motivations. Now, of course, a lot of it simply has to do with the fact that nearly everybody in the United States, and I'll just stop with the United States, but nearly everybody in the United States was at least a racialist in the 1840s and 1850s. They thought in terms of races having different characteristics, different gifts, and the like. So it was the easiest thing in the world for these Americans in California to say, what in the world are these Chinese doing here? What are these Italians doing here? What are these South Americans doing here? What are these Mexicans doing here? What right do they have to this gold? So that was part of the thing. And then, of course, there was simply a matter of If they don't get the gold, I'll get more for myself. So, but I should point out also, there were countervailing tendencies and influences, just by the way, as there were in the eastern part of the United States. From the 1870s and 1880s, there were cries for at least caps, maybe other restrictions on immigration into the United States, because for heaven's sake, all these Italians and Greeks and Russians and Poles are coming here, and the country is changing before our very eyes, and before we know it, it's not going to look like the United States. Okay? So there were people saying we've got to stop immigration. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen, except in the case of Chinese, which is mostly a Western thing, until the 1920s. And why didn't it happen? Because there were other people who were saying, let them all come in. Now, some of these people, I suppose, were sincere, what shall we say, multiculturalists. The term actually is utterly out of place for that time. But some of them said, this is a country of immigrants, so let the immigrants come. Of course, a lot of them were simply employers who wanted cheap labor. And that's exactly what was the countervailing tendency in California. So there were some who said, keep all the Chinese out, for example. Others who said, no, the Chinese are going to be our gardeners, they're going to build our railroads ultimately, they're going to work cheap. So these two fought over each other, and at various times, for example, the California legislature passed a foreign miners tax that was going to tax foreigners for being miners. It was passed, it was repealed, it was passed, it was repealed. It was hard to enforce. It created all sorts of ill will. But there definitely was, and then, by the way, and I haven't even mentioned the fate of the Native Americans, the Indians who were living here. That's an entirely different question, and it certainly did not reflect well on the newcomers. But there's a chapter on that in the book. Other questions? Maybe one more question? I don't want to wear you all out. Maybe you already have, if that's all the questions. Yes, in the back. Sure.
Oh, once you got into the research, what surprised you the most of this information that you've shared with us tonight?
The thing that surprised, the question is, what surprised me most about researching and about doing the tale of the California Gold Rush? The thing that really surprised me was to the extent to which this was a world story. I had been prepared, after, as I say, reading these American history textbooks, to think that this was a bigger story for American history. So my initial plan was to say, you know, the California Gold Rush is often thought of as a chapter in California history. No, it's really a chapter in American history. But when I realized how many people were coming from all over the world, and the effects, for example, in sparking other gold rushes and other gold discoveries, I was surprised at the extent to which this was a chapter in world history. And if I want to push this notion of a new American dream a little bit farther, I would argue that it's what really sparked the big immigration into this country in the late 19th century and continuing down right until today. This idea that this is the place to go if you want to make a material success. This is the place to go if you're willing to take risks. So America becomes identified as the land of opportunity for people who will take a chance. So that's the thing that surprised. I really wasn't ready for that. But it makes my story even bigger, which is all the better. Well, thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. And needless to say, I'll be happy to sign any books for people who would like to buy them.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Sure. Maybe I can take this off.
H.W. Brands is a history professor at Texas A&M University. The Age of Gold is published by Doubleday, a division of Random House. Visit randomhouse.com/Doubleday for more information. Next week's History on